Welcome to today's webinar called Conducting a Basic Inventory. I'm Kate Philipson, the archive specialist for DHPSNY, and I'm glad you're here today. With DHPSNY, I conduct archival needs assessments, respond to technical questions, work on the statewide documentation plan and the more recent anti-racism resources blog project, and I develop and teach educational programming like this webinar. And hopefully at some point in the future, in-person workshops again. Today, while listening through this webinar, if you have any sound or technical issues, please let us know in the chat, as DHPSNY's communications coordinator, Marissa Halderman, is available for support. I have a few other housekeeping notes to mention quickly. My slides from today and any of the resources I discuss will be sent out to you with the recording link for this webinar within the next week or so. And we have some built-in time at the end to answer any questions that come up. But please feel free to type any questions into the chat at any point, and I'll try to address them as they're raised. But if I don't in the moment, I'll make sure to circle back at the end question period. Gonna give you a little about DHPSNY before we get into the topic at hand, just for anyone who is unfamiliar. The program is the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York program, which is a 5-year initiative to deliver essential training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs such as this webinar and in-person workshops, usually. Again, hopefully soon. DHPSNY is making these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records and/or library research materials, which is you all. DHPSNY is a collaboration between two long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. I do want to mention for everyone tuning in now or watching this before the upcoming deadline that these two programs they continue to offer funding opportunities separate of our free services. And one of them, the discretionary grant program for the conservation and preservation of library research materials, has an upcoming application deadline of November 20th, 2020. So the CP grant, as we call it, is described in much more depth in a separate DHPSNY webinar that you can find on our website. But while it doesn't fund inventory specifically, the CP grant will support general preservation surveys, environmental surveys of your site, photograph surveys, rehousing, repair, reformatting to microfilm, or the reformatting of photographs to more stable photographic media, improvement to environmental controls, and training activities. So I think it's relevant to mention here because hopefully some of the potential benefits that you'll find from conducting a basic inventory will lead to some of these fundable activities. So let's dive right in. Here are the big questions that we're going to be tackling today. First, we'll break down the details of what an archival inventory is, and more importantly, what a basic inventory is as compared to a more detailed project. We'll talk about all the reasons why you'd want to conduct an inventory, even a basic one. Essentially, looking at why it's an important and useful undertaking and a key tool to have for your organization. Then we'll break down the steps for how you approach an inventory, really dive into the process of doing the work. And lastly, once you're finished with the inventory, what do you do next? How do you use this tool most effectively? So I know that we've all probably spent a lot of time with the Society of American Archivists Dictionary of Archives terminology, right? If you have, it's possible that you've come across this gem, the definition for inventory. It's written most simply as a list of things. And while this may be technically true on the grand scale, I hope that we might all agree it's a bit broad, at least for our purposes today. I'm talking specifically about an archival inventory. SAA also mentions other definitions that are in the context of archival description, calling an inventory a quote finding aid that includes a list of the series in a collection, or otherwise in the context of records management, stating that an inventory means the process of surveying the records in an office. And all of these are accurate to some degree, but I'd like to propose a definition that I think is neither too broad nor too specific to only certain aspects of archival work. So here it is on the screen. A formal list of the property in a repository, ideally connecting a physical object to a location and to a number in the catalog or other formal record. So an archival inventory is what you have on the shelves or on exhibition at your organization, and it will help you know where those things are. This definition gives us a sense of what a basic inventory will look like and how it will function in an archival repository. So let's clarify this definition a bit further between what we're really focusing on today, the task of a basic inventory, as compared to a more detailed inventory. So what I want to stress here is that while this seems like a potentially huge project, right? It's not as big or complicated as conducting an inventory that would look at every object or every piece of paper within your repository. We won't even look that closely within any single collections in this type of process. So we're talking specifically about creating an overview of your entire repository and of all the collections that you hold. DHPSNY works with so many different types of organizations, big and small, and structured very differently from one another. But the recommendation to conduct a basic inventory is really one of the most consistent things we say to everyone, because we so often hear about the unknown. Oh, we're not sure what's in that closet or in those drawers, or something like, oh, we think we took in this collection from a donor at some point, but we're not really sure where it wound up. So a basic inventory is meant to be cursory, a somewhat quick and not super detailed process to get a sense of all the materials and where they are. So in part, this will mean keeping in mind that archives are managed in the aggregate. We know that a lot of repositories throughout New York State have object collections too, these sort of more, museum-like collections. But for an archival basic inventory, don't forget that collections should not be thought of in terms of individual items. The more you can group collections together, the better off you'll be for these purposes. Another way to illustrate this distinction, I think, is that an inventory is not a collections survey. During a collection survey, you would be looking more carefully within collections and folders themselves with the intention of more comprehensive description. You can do that later in the course of archival management. It's important, but it's not what we're going to talk about here. I think one more helpful way to differentiate a basic inventory from a detailed inventory is that it is most often, though not always, but it's used as an internal tool. It's a document for staff and volunteers, and it's for collections management. You aren't really providing it to the public. On the other hand, detailed inventory information, say for a specific collection that you hold, might have a listing of the folders within it, and this would help populate the descriptive records of your archival collection that maybe get published on your website, or they're used, for finding aids or catalog records, something that researchers and the public use to help hone in on their research. That's the more detailed side of what you use a detailed inventory for. So as you can see, there are really different goals and purposes for basic inventories as compared to detailed ones. So what is the purpose here, right? Why do we want to have this overarching, not super detailed knowledge of our collections? While the detail would be great, it also takes a lot of time to gather, and you wind up with a lot of data to manage, especially if you are an organization with a small staff or a volunteer corps and a limited budget. It turns out that managing all that data and the more intensive level of details is easier to do if you're already working with the baseline of a basic inventory. We'll talk about these three core reasons next, but think about what I mean, how having intellectual control of your materials, having accountability for the materials security and safety within your organization, and how being able to budget your resources, all these things are what you get from a basic inventory, and they're important to have sooner than later, or really as soon as possible. And they're often important to have in advance of doing more detailed inventory work. It's also worth keeping in mind that these three core reasons all interact with each other, as I think you'll see as we talk through them. So first, let's look at the concept of intellectual control. This first sentence is really the core of why intellectual control is so important. Knowing what you have and how to find it is the first step in being able to take care of it, right? Which is a huge part of all of our missions of taking care of archival collections in some form. So in other words, your overall collections management and collections care activities will be all the more productive and valuable if you have a clear sense of all the materials in the repository and a clear sense of where to access them. Like what we've been talking about so far, conducting a basic inventory is what gives you a comprehensive scope of understanding for the collections in your repository. Besides this being a generally important thing, and essentially the same thing as knowing what you have, uh, thinking about the collection scope will help your organization with some policy decisions and developments. Well, I think there are quite a few different policies that are impacted by having intellectual control. One of the most important is the collection development policy to determine the guidelines about what your organization does and doesn't collect in terms of topics, geographical parameters, materials types, time periods, and more. You first need to understand what you already hold. Also related to intellectual control is that conducting a basic inventory allows you to know what collections are not formally accessioned into the repository. Accessioning is the formal process of transferring ownership of an acquisition to the organization, both physically, legally, and intellectually. So an inventory may help you identify that certain aspects of accessioning documentation are missing. Even if you have the materials themselves in front of you, the documentation could, maybe you can't find it. In turn, this increased intellectual control can help identify materials for deaccessioning, or possibly identify stuff that was never formally accessioned, but that the organization doesn't actually want to keep. Well, deaccessioning is an important aspect of any collections management program. It's possible that your organization isn't there yet. Maybe there's resistance at some level, or maybe you just don't know where to start. So at least beginning the conversation about what would be appropriate to deaccession or dispose of is a valuable first step that can be kicked off with the information you collect in the basic inventory. Here are some more fairly straightforward reasons, I think, why intellectual control and in turn conducting the inventory, a basic inventory, is important for collections management, right? Simply, it saves you time. Uh, and as we all know, having enough time for all the work that needs to get done is a consistent challenge for most organizations. Your work with collections, both internally and when you're public facing, will be more efficient if you have a basic inventory, knowing what collections exist and where they are. You won't have to go looking or digging for anything that you know is there somewhere, but you can't seem to find. Along these same lines, you can fundamentally provide more information to users if you have better intellectual control over your materials. This is not only more efficient, but supports a means to one of the core tenets of archives, that of greater access. Having more information for funders is also a good reason to conduct a basic inventory. You can describe collections and their importance better, and you can potentially have a clearer sense of projects or actions that collections require. So with inventory information, you can make a better argument for access and in turn for better funding. Developing processing priorities will also come with improved intellectual control. Knowing fully what and how many collections you hold, how big they are, these can help your organization understand which collections should be prioritized for processing based on interest, size, and or relevance to your mission. Of course, the information collected in the inventory can also initiate the next steps for description. And so this all leads to improved access too. In addition to processing and description, conducting an inventory supports the designation of preservation priorities. One of the things that you will note during the inventory, even when it's a cursory one, is whether any materials are damaged or fragile. You'll know where those materials are to be able to move or stabilize them for the short term against continued deterioration if that seems necessary, or to help prioritize the steps that they will need for more intensive preservation treatments. Even more simply, you can understand overall housing needs better with this kind of data. Another reason that it's important to learn the conditions of materials during the basic inventory is so that you can monitor condition information over time. Uh, to get a sense of conditions now or as soon as possible will help you in 1 or 2, 5 or 10 years into the future to know if materials need different environments, locations, or preservation planning depending on how they compare. Say if they've changed or deteriorated over time. So the inventory really helps you set your baseline. Gaining complete intellectual control from your basic inventory also means identifying if there's any key information missing about a collection. We'll talk more about what data you are actually collecting in a little bit, in order to make the inventory process as smooth and comprehensive as possible. But for now, you can see what might not be there in your records, such as accession numbers, creators or donors, or dates. I'd say it's pretty normal for collections that have been managed in different ways over different decades to be missing key information. So conducting the inventory will let you figure out where those gaps are in the interest of being able to fill them in. And lastly, organization intellectual control is important because it supports general transparency and accountability for your organization. Having comprehensive knowledge of your collection is key to making sure that staff or volunteers, board members, users, funders, and communities are all able to be on the same page, at least about what it is that the organization is managing. As I mentioned earlier, these reasons why we want to inventory are all connected. So we'll talk about accountability next too, and what that looks like in terms of completing an inventory. So this one's only one slide, I promise. But when we talk about how a basic inventory contributes to your organizational accountability, again, there's a few reasons why it's helpful and important to do. So first, conducting an inventory really helps support the security and safety of your collections. With a clear, clearer knowledge of what you have, your organization will have a much clearer sense of if there are any lost, missing, or stolen materials. In part, this can come into play when you do follow-up inventories down the road, and we'll also talk about that process a bit later. But your materials will be safer and your organization better able to keep them safe in perpetuity with a baseline inventory. Being accountable and having documentation of your collections is also essential for insurance needs. I'm not going to get into the details of archival and art insurance here today, but suffice it to say that in order to have your collections insured with a policy in the first place, you need to know what you have. Uh, if there was ever an emergency or disaster that affected your collections, you would also need an up-to-date inventory in order to make an insurance claim against any policy that you held. Also, along the lines of emergency preparedness planning, having a basic inventory is very useful to be able to set salvage priorities. As with everything else we've been talking about, the inventory will give you a clearer sense of the scope of all your materials, and you can't plan to save, rescue, or salvage the most important materials or collections within the repository if you don't know what you have overall. It's also possible that you've already had some form of disaster, which I hope is not the case for anyone, but you might be inventorying to retrieve information about your collections that may have been lost already. So on the other side of the slide here, I'll just point you towards some other DHPSNY webinars about emergency planning and preparedness that can help you start to develop this important area of managing your collections and navigating salvage priorities. The time marker notes that I've included here on the slide for each of these two different webinars that are available for free on the DHPSNY website. These points speak most specifically to thinking about collection salvage priorities and collection salvage planning as a whole. The last essential piece of why we're conducting a basic inventory and why it's so important is that it will allow you to more accurately and effectively budget your time and allocate resources to where they can make the best impact. Of course, there are lots of factors to consider for every organization and its unique collections, but all collections management takes time and labor to do the work, takes supplies to safely store and house materials, and it takes money, which of course feeds into the other 2 points here. So in meeting all of those things, time, funds, and supplies, you can better plan for how to navigate them in relationship to the categories on this slide when you conduct a basic inventory. These are all essential aspects to managing your collections, everything you see here. They are related, of course, to the intellectual control aspect of why it's helpful to conduct an inventory. But here, when talking about budgeting, you should be thinking about what you need to actually accomplish those management tasks. You will be able to prepare for the future with the knowledge of your materials scope and quantity, as well as the knowledge of what condition they're in. In that vein, you can also know more clearly what kinds of funding might be required for damaged or fragile materials and potential conservation projects, which often require an outside vendor to be paid. You can fundraise specifically for certain projects or certain materials, and you'll be able to more clearly assess and allocate funds for new boxes or folders or specialized housing enclosures, answering questions such as how many or what sizes, or paying for storage furniture such as flat files for maps, posters, and oversized documents. And if you have potential moving or renovation possibilities in the future, you can better estimate the amount of space you will actually need with a full inventory completed. There are obviously costs associated with a move or renovation too, both financially and again with the labor and time of staff or volunteers. So it's just good to have as much information as possible. So I know that's a lot of the why, but I thought it was important to build out and break down this argument because it's relatively normal for a site to say, oh, yes, we know we need an inventory. We know it could be helpful, but there's too much else to do here. And my argument is that that will always be true. There's always too much to do. Um, but there's also a situation where maybe you aren't the sole decision maker, and so a higher level of management, a committee or a board of trustees needs to be convinced that conducting a basic inventory is a worthwhile idea to spend the time on, even if they do understand that it's a good idea. So I hope some of this reasoning can be useful to encouraging the necessary will and ability to carve out the time for conducting an inventory. Now that that is all said, how in the heck do we go about doing this work? Right? We'll look at three main steps and some other useful planning needs to consider in order to break down the process. So hopefully this work will get you to a point of confidence about starting off on the right foot with your inventory. First and foremost, it's important to make a plan for your inventory work. You thought we were just going to dive in and start opening cabinets and filling up spreadsheets, huh? We're trying to help you prepare for completing this project clearly and efficiently, where you can get the most benefit out of it. So it will take a bit more advanced effort, but the intention is to make sure that the actual inventory work goes smoothly. Oop, wrong. Sorry. This one. To kick off your plan, you should articulate, probably on paper or written down somewhere, a goal and a scope for the inventory project itself. The goal can include an estimated length of time that you'd like to spend, and maybe one or two of the why aspects that we just talked about above. Um, well, I think you can expect all of those reasons to be productive. If there are specifics that you think are most important for your organization, lay them out. And while the length of time that you really need will depend on many things, such as your labor resources and the tools you're working with, and the time you can feasibly commit, I think it's helpful to just estimate this up front and in the setting some goals for yourself. Directly related to defining a goal is defining what information you want to capture in your inventory. We'll talk about the most likely stuff in step 3 here, but I'm mentioning it now because planning for this type of data is essential. While it's important to be able to be flexible and to note missing data or capture something that you didn't expect to see, you want to know in advance what you're looking for and to have your tools for capturing it accurately prepared. And don't worry, we'll talk about tools in a minute or two. But relating to tools, I do think it's fair to say that they will most likely involve some form of technology. So you should set in place, especially when there will be multiple people working on the inventory project, what computer you might use or what software. Can a document be shared easily between multiple people or computers? Where is it stored so that it's accessible for everyone? Ensure that you have a backup process. Losing your work at any point would be pretty discouraging, but it's truly unnecessary if you prepare well. And if you're doing this inventory on paper, I think the same questions apply. Similarly, like deciding what information and tools you will use, it is important to document other decisions that might get made as well, and to record the agreed upon processes for the inventory work itself. For example, you will want to know how to record the fact that you might have missing information, and what to do if this happens so that the situation stays consistent throughout the project. I'll stress that while this documentation of process is especially key if multiple different people are working on the inventory, it's also very much worthwhile to document these choices if you are the only one there. The organization and other people will look at it and use this inventory in the future, right? So having a sense of how the work was conducted is only a positive and useful part of the puzzle. Basically, as much transparency and communication as possible will help sustain the whole organization. Lastly, maybe this one should go without saying, but I look at it as an encouragement to make sure that you are systematic in your decisions, in your documentation, in your preparation for the inventory, and in the inventory work itself. Have a system, follow it, and reassess if you need to or feel that the project is going off track. You shouldn't be afraid to be flexible where necessary. Uh, so, two sort of side notes to address here. Um, they sort of fit within this making a plan, I think. The first is that in case anyone is wondering if they should wait or when might be the best point to conduct an inventory and to start making this plan, I want to reassure you that the best time to start is now. As we talked about earlier, a basic inventory is the baseline of good collections management. So the sooner you can have it squared away, the better you will be able to move forward with other essential archival management tasks. One thing to keep in mind, and you can add this into your planning stages and reassess later if needed, you will want to establish a timeline for when next regular inventories will happen in your repository. This will help confirm updates and new acquisitions and ensure that they're in the right locations. And it will also speak to the accountability goals we talked about earlier, such as identifying lost, missing, or stolen collections items. We'll also touch on this again in the final slash next steps conversation for after the inventory is completed. But I think it's worth knowing about now as you're making a plan. The other quick side note to mention for this planning stage is about tools. I'm not really certain, but maybe this gentleman in the pictures, his Apple Parer apparatus will be a useful tool for conducting your inventory. Okay, I'm sorry. I just really love this image, even if it's not directly related to archives. More accurately, one of the best things we can recommend as a tool for a basic inventory is a simple spreadsheet. If you have access to Microsoft Office, this can work well, or Google Sheets is a similar equivalent. Um, while most inventory templates that I could find created by organizations were made for different purposes, such as a much more detailed records management type of task, if you have access from peers or colleagues to a template or a pre-designed form, feel free to use it if it's appropriate to your project, or edit it to meet your needs as well. However, we hope this project overall is basic enough for you to be able to make your own spreadsheet. You might also be interested in using a word processing document instead of a spreadsheet. Uh, if this works better for you and feels more comfortable, I say go for it. Just keep in mind how you want to use your data moving forward and know that you'll have different types of management and manipulation available for that data depending on what type of document and structure you use. Another tool that could potentially be helpful in conducting an inventory is a content management system, or CMS. If your organization is already using a CMS, again, your work with it will depend on multiple factors. But if you have collections being managed within it already, this can still support your inventory work and help structure the format and data that you want to collect. Alternately, or additionally, you may wind up doing some retrospective data entry as part of the inventory work to align your descriptions and locations of collections with their current status. One last type of tool to keep in mind is what materials you may potentially need for labeling your collections, housing, storage areas, etc., while you're doing the inventory. This would be necessary if you are coming across unlabeled boxes or shelves, or especially if you find mislabeled things. So we're talking about temporary labeling at this stage. I want to stress that, as you don't need to mix up your inventory work with your permanent labeling tasks. Just consider them separate tasks. More permanent solutions should be done after the inventory work, once you have a sense of the full scope of collections. DHPSNY strongly recommends that you use pencil as opposed to any other type of writing implement, as pen and marker can be potentially damaging around materials. We also always caution you to not use tape in or around archival collections ever. For temporary labeling, I'll mention Post-it notes because they're appropriate, but they also require a level of care in that you do not ever put them directly on archival materials. Post-it notes have a light adhesive, but it can still be too much for many types of historic or fragile documents. And I have another caution when using Post-it notes, in the sense that they can very easily fall off or be stuck onto something else, maybe such as your sweater when you walk away, which would defeat the whole purpose of using them to improve organization. So Post-it notes must be a very temporary solution, replaced as soon as possible by permanent labels. You can also simply use paper with no adhesive to label boxes, cabinets, or shelving. Just lay it flat on or in the boxes or shelves in a way that is clear and corresponding to your inventory. And then you return later to more permanently label. So step two, I think I have this conversation fairly often, where an organization insists that they don't really have any kind of inventory or list that would be useful for knowing what materials they have. And then they mention something offhand about a different type of organizational tool. And from that, I realized maybe it's a book directory or an accession register for them to work from, right? Something already exists. Maybe it's not even a list, but a file drawer full of signed deeds of gift or accession or acquisition records of some form, right, that have a record of the collections. They're already held by the organization and it's written down. So the point here really is to think critically about the work that you have already done or that someone previously has done while working with the organization that can feed into the inventory project that you are about to do. Even if it's not completed, right? If you find a started and then unfinished project, you're a step ahead still if you are able to build off of existing work. But to be clear, it's possible that someone else's work really might not make any sense to you right away. That I think that's a possibility. Depending on what it is, I've had folks say to me, "Oh, well, they use this numbering system and we really don't understand what it means now." Of course, this is not an ideal situation, but it doesn't mean that there is nothing useful within that work at all. Even if you can't figure out an older system, spending some time with lists or inventories can help you understand where the organization was at with its collections at a different point in its history. And I think it's likely that this will help you move forward. Um, the other important thing to mention here is whether you are working from past work, past inventory work, or accession records, an index that just emerged, or a version of finding aids that you've been producing. You should make sure to start the inventory process with whatever documentation you do already have. Use the written lists or materials, written recording records to compare to the material on your shelves, as opposed to making a list of collections based on the shelves that you observe and then going back to reconcile this newly created list with any existing documentation. This will get confusing, and it can cause you to miss aspects of the collection. So if you had no previous documentation at all, this rule doesn't apply, right? Go ahead and start from scratch. But if you have some information to start working with already, use that as your basis for moving forward to record the inventory. Okay, so this is getting down to the brass tacks of the inventorying work. What do you actually want to know about your collections? A reminder here that you'll be receiving these slides after the webinar, so I'm sorry if this slide is a little dense, but we'll be on it for a minute. So first, in the interest of transparency, documentation, and preparing for the future of your organization, be clear about who is doing the inventory work and when it's being done. This can be recorded overall for the project with a date range and a list of all participants, or depending on the type of spreadsheet you create and how many people are working on it, you might want to have these categories as columns. They get continually recorded as the project progresses, right? Joe worked on it on these dates, and Susan worked on it on these other dates, and then Joe worked on it again on the following week, something like that. Make sure you get the more identifying information for the collection itself, right? This will be the creator or donor of the collection and its title, even if the title seems repetitive, such as creators papers. But those two are separate columns, really, the creator and the title. If you have some artificial collections, which are archival collections that are not defined by the provenance of the material's creator or donor, your title might be assigned by format, such as postcard collection or local photographs. Information that is also essential to record is any numbers that exist with the collection, such as accession or catalog numbers, which should apply per collection, of course. You shouldn't be working at an object level, so you won't be recording any object numbers. If there aren't any numbers at all, or if they're inconsistent, that's okay. Just mark down what you can identify at this point. The medium or format and the quantity are also essential pieces of information for your inventory. You want to make sure to be clear about what you're recording and try to stay consistent in your very basic description. As we've been talking about, right, stick with the big picture, no items. Think about the number of shelves, boxes, drawers, and just make sure that you are noting this information as they relate to the overall collections of materials. Any designation of quantity is okay, again, as long as you are being consistent. I think the location information goes along with quantity. And keep in mind that this data especially can remain flexible so that it is able to be easily updated in the future if needed. For instance, if you are rearranging materials to make more storage space, or you have some new storage furniture, you want to make sure you have defined names for each room, building, closet, or space in which you have materials stored. You can also label shelves, drawers, filing cabinets, racks, etc. as needed, and also can considering maybe creating a map or a floor plan of locations for storage furniture and for materials for collections, if that is helpful. You may have already done this work in your early planning stages, or it may be easier to complete here when thinking about locations and how you record them in your inventory. And I will say that I'm sorry to be speaking so generally, but there are just so many different types of sites and setups, that it's impossible to speak to every situation. But again, one of the most important aspects here is to document your decisions and to be consistent. These next 3 points of what to record are where you might need to look a little bit closer to assess the information that you need, but remember to not get too bogged down in the details. In considering the condition issues of the collections you're looking at, see if anything is folded, torn, crumbling, yellowing. Photographs could have notable issues, or book bindings might be coming apart. If you see anything that is dirty, or maybe if audiovisual material is without any kind of housing or cases, these are all things worth noting. If you come across a collection that is all stuffed into a box, whether it's just papers or mixed mediums, but none of it is housed in any folders or cases, even if it's in good shape overall, you want to note that this collection needs to be rehoused, right? Or that this box needs rehousing. Maybe if a collection is very cramped within a file cabinet drawer, but it seems to be housed well in folders, it's still maybe important to note that this needs more storage space to have a little bit more room to breathe. You don't want to do this rehousing work in the moment, but having a record of how much of this kind of work you will need to do in the future is important. I want to mention measurements as related to condition, housing, and storage, but this is in brackets on the screen here because it's somewhat optional, I think. As we've mentioned, it really depends on your time and your goals for the inventory, and this might be more detail than you need at this stage. But I'm including it because if you're thinking about reworking of your space needs or starting to plan for a potential move, knowing the linear or cubic feet of space taken up by each collection could be important information for you. There are online tools for calculating these measurements if you have very standard archival boxes. And if you don't have those kinds of boxes, you can also get creative with a ruler. Lastly, if there is missing information about collections as you are inventorying, especially in the creator, title, and numbers fields, you don't need to necessarily break your stride or momentum to go figure out this information in the moment, but it's important that you record what you're missing. To have a complete inventory and to have clear intellectual control over the collections, you'll go back and fill in this information as needed. But make sure for now that you have a way to denote missing information up front so that your spreadsheet or documentation appears completed, right? If someone else looked at the inventory without description of the project, even though you're creating useful documentation, if they looked at it, would they think that someone skipped or missed those fields by accident? Or would they understand that the work was done, but the information isn't available and is being sought out? So I want to stress again that which data fields you record will be very different depending on different materials types and depending on your archive structure and goals for the inventory. We've gone over the most basic things that are relevant to almost any kind of archival collections, but if you're assessing media or audiovisual collections, you might require some different data fields such as format or possibly runtime. If you are navigating binders of photographs, note down what type of plastic materials the photos are housed in, or maybe it's important within the scope of your collections to know whether you have color or black and white photographs as a large swath of material. So depending on your materials and your organization's mission, even recording the dates that they were created could be essential during this process so that you don't have to dig for that information or research it again further in the future. You can make your own decisions about the importance of what fields to record as long as you remain consistent. And I'll add in, remain realistic about the information that is important to record for you. So I want to mention a few reminders here because I think it's important to stress these points, even though I've talked about them a few times. So forgive me. You're going to keep this kind of inventory basic, right? Which means not working at an item level. You want this cursory listing of the collections you hold per room, on shelves, of boxes and file cabinets, and where these collections are located with the type of brief information recorded that we just talked about. Again, keep in mind that an inventory is not a collection survey. A collection survey sort of looks more in depth in the collections and with the intention of comprehensive description. You spend more time working to understand the materials themselves and their information and their context than you do in just kind of scanning the shelves and the conditions, which is what we're trying to encourage here. Something else to remember while you're conducting the inventory is about a catch that you might not notice if you aren't paying attention for it. If you have labels on your boxes and containers, you are definitely ahead of the game. That's a great step. But sometimes the label can get out of alignment with the actual materials that are in the box or in the cabinet drawer. So make sure that as you are inventorying and noting down collections titles and numbers and quantities, that you double check what is inside of the containers too, to ensure its accuracy. And if it's not accurate, flag this issue, right? Flag it both on the inventory document you're working on and physically with your temporary labeling tools. If you start to see this happening more than once or twice, it's probably worth looking for a pattern to try to understand what might be causing the discrepancy. Again, have a plan for consistently documenting this issue should it arise, which hopefully it doesn't. And really, like, don't get bogged down in the details, which is a different way of saying keep up your own momentum. If you find yourself taking too long on one aspect of your collections or getting stuck and questioning what to do because it feels confusing, I'd encourage you to note it down as simply as you can and note that you'd like to come back to that area and then keep moving forward. Again, maybe patterns that emerge as you work through the inventory and the full scope of collections can help solve any of the details that did stop you up earlier. So lastly, we're going to talk about what to do next once your inventory is done. Of course, there are the aspects that we talked about in the goals section, all the different projects you can plan for and take on once you have better intellectual control, accountability, and an easier capability for budgeting your overall collections management work and resources. But for focusing on the inventory document itself, I want to first stress how important it is to back up your work. You should try to be doing this all along, as we mentioned, but especially at the end, you have to make sure that you safeguard all the effort you've put in thus far, right? You want to make sure that copies of the inventory, as well as any other essential collections documentation that you might have, and other critical records like emergency plans, that these things have an offsite storage location. This would be in the cloud, maybe, where you have to ensure that access, such as links, usernames, and passwords to the collections storage area, to the storage area, are written down. And if you back up the inventory and documents on an external hard drive or two or more, and physically distribute them in different places, write this information down too as part of the inventory documentation process. and or as part of the overall essential documentation for your organization as a whole. If there is ever an emergency or disaster at your site, multiple people need to know how to access the backup documentation and not lose all the hard work put into collections management. It is also important, after you've completed the basic inventory, to implement a schedule for future inventories. I mentioned this quickly before when talking about the question of when to conduct an inventory. And a good answer to that question is also to conduct it with some consistency. You can plan for regular times, say maybe annually, that you do a basic inventory again, which helps with the accountability aspect of keeping track of your security of your collections. You may also want to do what's called a spot inventory, randomly picking an area or a few collections to check, say every 4 to 6 months or whatever feels reasonable. Follow-up inventories are especially important if you regularly move materials around to or from exhibition spaces, or if you have a high number of researchers using materials, right? Or if you've changed anything about your storage space and housing, uh, you'll also want to note whether locations or conditions have changed for the materials in storage. So doing these kinds of updates to your inventory, especially when you are actively moving materials, is important and beneficial to keeping up with this documentation work for the organization as a whole. Also worth noting as a next step, we also kind of mentioned this a few times earlier, but if you come across any missing data, right, you need to go back and do the work to fill in what you can. This might mean formally accessioning something, or providing it with a number, or doing some research about a donor or creator. But this is especially key if your inventory turns up what we often call found in collections materials, right? Meaning that you have very little or no information about how the materials even got to your repository. This might require more legwork, and you will have to make decisions about what happens to these kinds of materials. Maybe they get accessioned if they fit into the mission and the collection scope, or maybe they wind up being disposed of in a variety of ways, such as transferring them to other local repositories where the materials fit better. Right. In another DHPSNY webinar on our site called Accessioning from January 2019, you can find a lot more information about how to handle these found in collections materials. So we've learned about what a basic inventory is, and we understand more clearly the reasons for why they are beneficial to your repository and your overall collections management needs. We also looked at what to keep in mind and the steps to take when you start conducting an inventory, as well as the information that you should be recording and the follow-up steps to the project. There will very often be caveats to inventorying, right? It's not always a straightforward process. Even though I hope I presented it clearly and effectively here today, and hopefully with what we talked about, you can feel more confident about having the tools to start the project, or even beginning to get your organization on board. I think that's a good first step too. The biggest takeaway, I hope, is to not be afraid of the process and to dive into making your own list of things. Although I will say, as opposed to this little comic that you see on the slide, we implore you to use the nice pencil instead of a pen. So thank you all for listening and for being here and for your time today. You know, it is valuable. Here on this slide is my email address and direct contact information. And we have time to answer questions now. We have 10, 15 minutes, I think. But in case you have to leave or would prefer to have your questions answered later, do please feel free to email me at any time, whether it's about what we've talked about here today, or if you have any lingering questions about other related DHPSNY services. I'd be glad to help answer them or direct you to a good resource, so please don't hesitate to reach out. I know I'll switch to this slide, and I know that I did see a question earlier, so let me slide up. Someone made a comment much earlier in talking about the tools and forms that said they used a Google form that fed into a Google Excel sheet. That was a good mix depending on the task and the person's skill level. Yeah, I think that could also be a great solution. Google Forms can be a little bit more user-friendly than a spreadsheet, so thank you to the person who mentioned that. My chat window is really small, so it doesn't show everyone's name. Let's see, I have another question that says, if you have records in random boxes with no real inventory ever being done, what would you suggest as a starting point with coming up with an inventory list or subject matter list? That's a good question. I think this sort of applies to the, wow, yeah, if it's all super random, I think you do need to start with sort of looking in your boxes. And again, you can keep it cursory, you can keep it simple, but you need to try to get a sense of what you have. If nothing is labeled, if you have some labels, start with your labels. Maybe the labels aren't just on boxes or drawers, they could be on folders. Maybe they're on groups of papers somehow. Start with what you have. I know when the question is everything's random and messy, starting with what you have sounds still very difficult. You know, take a look through and record what you can is the best I can think of right now. Start writing it down and start seeing where your topics, you know, overlap and align, and then try to get broader as possible. Hope that is helpful. Let me see. Someone mentioned, I think this is a similar question. One full room and just me, no accession info, creator, donor, collection title info for most of the collection, where to begin? Yeah, again, I think the answer is similar. Work with any labels on any boxes. Work with any documentation that exists anywhere. Do your best to find something, and if it's not, then you can start opening boxes to get a sample, maybe just of to try to understand a pattern of how your materials are arranged at the moment, right? You can, it's hard when it's completely random. I absolutely sympathize. I have seen it, but you can, even before you move anything around, right? If you have a full room, you don't need to start shifting and planning things into piles, but you can start looking at what you have and mentally, and you know, writing down sort of what you think your categories are, and what you think your patterns are that you see about collection information, what goes together. If you're finding any kind of, this looks like it all maybe came from one person, this really just looks like a box of photographs, seeing what your groupings look like. I know that's not amazingly helpful, but you can, maybe the lesson is to still try to start basic. Start with the simplest information that you do have that you can find and try to identify some patterns. Someone's question says, can you explain what creator is in the context to the inventory? Sure. The archives, you know, in considering them traditionally, a collection is most often maintained by the sort of organization of an archive is in the provenance. So a creator is who made this group of records that is donated to the archive for preservation. So it sometimes, often, the creator of the records is the donor. I'm trying to just think of a very simple example. You know, Mary Smith lived in town in the local, you know, in a small town, and she took photographs all her life of her community and donated all her photographs and related documents to the local historical society. So that collection would be the collection of Mary Smith's papers. And so when you do the inventory, you'd be looking for Mary Smith as the creator, and also the title of the collection, which may be titled something else, like, you know, local photographs. But we often try to recommend that a donated collection is kept together, not broken up, which is a whole other discussion. So I recommend that you maybe can check out some other DHPSNY webinars about archival management. I hope that does your question a little bit of justice. Let me see if there are any other questions. Sorry, someone asked if I can show my email address again, and I will go back to this slide. Let's see. How frequently should a follow-up inventory be conducted? Annually, asking if annually makes sense. I think annually does make sense. If it can fit, you know, I think that's a good general timeline. If you have so much going on that it's really hard to fit in annually, you can do it less frequently than that. You can do it more frequently than that, depending on your situation. But I think annually is a pretty good average. Yes, someone asked if the process for accessioning found in collections items is covered in the accessioning webinar, and I believe it is. The accessioning webinar goes over a lot about accessioning, especially what to do more about those types of collections that you have very little information on. Someone asked, do you have any sort of benchmark rate at which we can expect or hope to inventory? Like X linear feet per day. I'm trying to estimate how long it will take me to inventory a large storage room. That is a really good question, and I don't off the top of my head, but I can make sure I know those resources exist. Again, that often falls into the category of everything is different, right? And depending on what types of information you're planning to record and what tools you're using, all of those things will differ for how many linear feet you can manage to inventory at a time. It also just depends on how your materials are set up currently, right? Are they totally random? Are they all labeled already? But I'll try to track down some estimates, some time estimates for archival collections, and whatever I can find, I'll make sure to include in the little list of resources that we send out with the slideshow, with the slides. So sorry, I can't answer that at the moment, but I will try to follow up with it. Someone else comment. I guess you can all, I'm reading these for the recording. I know most folks who are still here can read these in the chat box, but to say it out loud, here's just a suggestion from a attendee. It says, I approach this situation, I think of it as peeling the onion, right? I start with boxes and document them, and then go down inside the box and use inductive processes. So, right, that's eventually, after you do a full basic inventory, definitely important to eventually look inside the box and see what else you have. Form inventory. I don't see any other questions. Let me just check with Marissa in case I'm. Thank you all again. Hang on one more minute for any other questions. Thanks everyone for your comments and questions and thoughts on this process. I know it's a challenge, but hopefully this can help get you started. Thanks again for coming, and take care and stay safe.